Hello friends, today we are going to talk about the big financial crisis going on in Sri Lanka. As you are aware, Sri Lanka has declared a state of emergency and almost all its private sector banks have run out of foreign exchange. Today, they do not have money to pay for their imports. Situation is really bad. There is a severe food shortage going on in the country right now. Government has called military to ration food supplies. Government has also banned import of some of the non-essential items, and now it is banning import of some of the items like spices, oil, etc. As we speak, Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserve is around $2.8 billion, and that is sufficient to pay import bills only for next 2.5 months. On top of that, Sri Lanka has almost $2 billion of foreign exchange debt to be repaid in next few months. And things will get very difficult for Sri Lanka unless China or IMF bails Sri Lanka out. Let's look at what was happening in Sri Lanka's economy in last 5 years. Sri Lanka's GDP right now is around $81 billion, and Sri Lanka had been growing at 3 to 4% year on year in last 5 years. Now, the growth was very slow as compared to other developing countries in the world. If you look at the total import-export profile of Sri Lanka, there is a $5 billion gap between import and export. For example, in 2020, Sri Lanka imported goods worth almost $15.7 billion, but its exports were only $10.7 billion. So there was a $5 billion gap between import and exports, which caused a lot of strain on foreign currency. This gap has been there from a long time, and there has not been much progress made in terms of increasing exports or decreasing imports. The other important aspect is the external debt which Sri Lanka has taken in last few years. Now, Sri Lanka's total external debt is almost 60% of its GDP, and there is a $4 to $5 billion of payout that it has to make year on year, almost every year, to make sure that it abides by its commitments to repay its debt. So if you look at the total import-export gap, that is around $5 billion, and then there is another $5 billion of repayments that it has to make. So $10 billion gap on the foreign exchange side. The worst part is not much FDI is coming into the country, because even if a country has big gap on import-export, but if there is a lot of FDI coming in the country, then that kind of compensates, especially from a foreign exchange side. Sri Lanka's FDI has been in the range of around $900 million, so not enough to cover the gap. So if you look at the overall imbalance in the economy, it has been there from a long time. You might have a question, what is changing now if this has been happening for so many years? Now, credit rating of Sri Lanka has been downgraded. Sri Lanka used to take loans to finance these obligations, and now loans have dried up because countries have started doubting whether Sri Lanka will be able to repay or not. And lastly, COVID has also hit Sri Lanka very hard. Its economy has stopped growing. It was growing at a very slow pace earlier, but that growth has also stopped. On top of that, Sri Lanka used to get a lot of foreign exchange because of tourism, and that has also completely stopped, dried down, because visitors are not coming to Sri Lanka because of travel restrictions. So all of this put together, along with the structural problems which were already there, are now causing havoc in Sri Lanka's financial system. Debt trap is really serious in Sri Lanka right now. Its external debt per individual in Sri Lanka is around $2,150. That is INR 1,60,000 rupees per person debt. It's a huge debt, and Sri Lanka is going to have tough time in repaying that in next few years. Talking about the overall COVID impact, Sri Lanka is losing almost $5 billion per year because of no tourism. Since there are travel restrictions, travelers are not coming to Sri Lanka, and because of that, directly, indirectly, Sri Lanka is losing almost $5 billion every year. That's a huge amount for a country with a GDP of $80 billion. Its GDP also contracted from $84 billion in 2019 to $80.7 billion in 2020. That is a big degrowth, especially for a country which has got a lot of debt, and it has anyways not been growing significantly in last few years. So all of these have put a lot of pressure on Sri Lanka's economy, especially on the foreign exchange side, because less exports, more imports, no FDI, COVID impact, and therefore no travelers, economy not growing. All of these have hit Sri Lanka together, and therefore its economy has started to crumble. What worsened the situation was agriculture reforms which got implemented this year. While I am not debating whether those reforms are right or wrong, but definitely the timing of those reforms has not been correct. In a year in which Sri Lanka was really struggling with a financial crisis, Sri Lanka banned use of chemical fertilizers in agriculture. It really hit production hard, and there is a shortage of food grains in the country. In a year in which it does not have money to pay for import, its domestic food grain production is also impacted, and therefore there is a big food crisis in Sri Lanka right now. Army has been deployed to do food rationing, and government is trying its best to make sure that there is no food hoarding happening right now in Sri Lanka. There is a crazy inflation on food items right now, and Sri Lanka's currency has almost lost 8 to 10% in last few months. Hopefully countries like India will learn a lesson from this. We should continue to increase our exports, continue to reduce our imports, try to be self-reliant, and make sure that we keep our debt under control. Thank you. Jai Hind.